Hi, good morning. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Jason Marzak. I'm the director of the Latin America Economic Growth Initiative at the Adrian Arch Latin America Center. And on behalf of our center and the Global Energy Center, Dick Morningstar, the director of the center, thanks for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to our discussion today and launch of our latest energy publication, Oil and Gas in Brazil, A New Silver Lining. A special welcome to the many distinguished guests here today from the business and policy worlds. Now, we're thrilled here today to be joined by what I consider to be an all-star panel on energy issues in Brazil. Juliano Basile, Washington correspondent for Valor Econômico, a publication that's well known to everybody who follows business issues in Brazil. Jason Fargo, the Latin America lead at Energy Intelligence. And then the author, of course, of today's policy brief, Décio Oronha, director of Plumo Logística and the former CEO of Petrobras Energia. Tweeting today is encouraged, but if you're going to tweet, please use the hashtag #ACBrazil. Now, today's discussion and our latest work on Brazil's energy outlook has proven to be even more timely than we could have imagined. 2 months into an interim government led by Michel Temer and less than 1 month away from hosting the Olympics, there is no doubt that Brazil is at, shall we say, a unique moment. Some may say that's a nice way of putting it. But here at the Atlantic Council, we firmly believe it. I think as the old adage goes, this too shall pass. And the country's long-term trajectory remains incredibly positive. This begins with a number of reforms underway or about to launch. The country's current political and economic turmoil has significant implications for its energy sector, but as today's policy brief explores, those effects are not necessarily negative. In fact, right now, we are in the midst of an inflection point. This is a term often used here around the halls of the Atlantic Council, but this is a term that is incredibly applicable to Brazil. There are profound opportunities right now for Brazilian policymakers and industry leaders to write the next chapter in the oil and gas sector. Yes, scandal has rocked state-owned giant Petrobras, and the company has amassed billions in unpaid debt and suffered deep damage to its reputation. In 2015, it registered the largest net loss in its history. But there are recent signs, this week in fact, that the Brazilian Congress is aiming to revamp the sector. A bill up for a vote next month would clear the path for greater private investment in offshore oil, removing a hurdle that had long held back exploration of this sector. So what else is needed to unlock the country's energy sector? And what is possible in the low-price environment? We believed these questions needed answers, that they were too important to gloss over given the broad relevance they have for Brazil's overall economic future. And that's why we commissioned this publication. Décio Oronha and the policy brief that we're launching today looks at these questions from a first-hand perspective given his numerous years in the industry in Brazil. Now, I'll say from an impartial point of view, or perhaps not, I'll say it's a must read for anyone trying to get a grip on what the Temer government can take, the steps the Temer government can take to reboot the industry, along with recommendations for the longer term. We have copies available outside today. Décio, congratulations on a fantastic publication. It's great to have you add to your list of titles now Atlantic Council author as well. The timing of this report really couldn't be very much better, and I look forward to your insight today. It's now my great pleasure to invite up to the stage our author, panelists, and the moderator, Andrea Murta, who is officially the center's associate director, but is unofficially known as our Brazil guru. Andrea will captain the rest of our event, and again, thank you all very much for joining us today. Andrea? Please.
Hello, everyone. Well, thank you, Jason. I'm also known as the Brazil Czar, so you may choose how you want to refer to me. So thanks, everyone, for being here this morning. It's truly a pleasure. If you follow our center, you might have noticed that this has been the unofficial Brazil month here at the Atlantic Council. We had a roundtable on trade a couple weeks ago, and then we had an event on the future of Brazilian politics, because we like challenges. And now we are finalizing the month with this very timely discussion on energy in Brazil. Jason introduced a little bit of our panelists today, but they are very distinguished, and I would be amiss if I didn't mention a few of their accomplishments from the past. So first, Décio, the author of our report, is a Brazilian, of course. He's an engineer by training, and he currently serves as the director of Prumo Logística. He has had leading roles throughout the energy sector, and I'll mention just a couple. He was president of Petrobras Bolivia. He was CEO of Petrobras Energia and vice president of Braskem. Then we have Juliano Basile on the far left there. Not only correspondent in Washington for Valor Econômico, but I have to say that he started his career at Folha de São Paulo, who's also my former employer. And he worked at Gazeta Mercantil, another very historically important financial publication in Brazil, in both Brasilia and São Paulo. And in the middle here, we have Jason Fargo, the Latin America team leader of energy intelligence. And what is important to say is that he's the only non-Brazilian in this panel. And usually that wouldn't be a plus in my eyes, but it will be today because he's going to add the international voice to this panel. Everybody else here is Brazilian, so he's the only one without an accent, although he speaks very good Portuguese. I've already tested that. So as a Brazilian myself, I'm super interested in this topic because not only it's important for Brazil, but I have lived through some of the transformations that Brazil had in somewhat a short span of time in the energy sector. So I remember very well when I was a kid and the blackouts were absolutely regular, and I didn't understand that candles were supposed to be romantic until a much later time because I thought it was just a matter of necessity. Then I remember I was at the Folha newsroom when we had the discovery of the pre-salt, and I remember the excitement and how everybody believed that this would be a forever game changer for Brazil. And now we are at a position where, well, it hasn't exactly materialized all of our hopes just yet, but that could be changed. And of course, we had problems with droughts, and the hydropower sector as well has had their setbacks. So things have changed a lot in Brazil. And I want to start framing the discussion that we're going to have today by asking Décio, basically, where are we now, and why is he such an optimist on the future of Brazilian energy? And I know this is going to be very hard, but if you can summarize, Décio, in just a couple minutes, why you are such an optimist, and where is our situation on the energy sector right now in Brazil?
Well, good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the Atlantic Council for the opportunity to write the policy briefing, to be here sharing my views with you. I really am an optimist about Brazil. And we had some opening words covering what happened in Brazil during the past few months. And I remember that the first draft of this work I did maybe in February.
Yeah, we've been working on it for a couple months, yeah.
And since then, we can say that things changed in the direction that we have written in the paper. And I believe that Brazil is experiencing now a learning period. And we have tested ideas, and we are understanding that some ideas, they don't really work, and we are opening up for ideas that were not kind of a consensus in Brazil some time ago. And that affects very much the investments and the energy sector. As I mentioned in the work, during the past 50 years, Petrobras has controlled the energy, oil and gas sector in Brazil, and it's now changing. It's not changing by a decision. It's changing because they need to change. The situation forces Petrobras to change, and by changing Petrobras, we change Brazil in the oil and gas in the oil and gas sector. And I believe that these opportunities are opening up for new companies that will work together with Petrobras in this sector in the future. These opportunities are opportunities we have never seen in the past. We have just one moment in the industry history in Brazil. Was back in the 90s, the end of the 90s, when the Petrobras monopoly was broken, and then we had new companies working in the E&P business, but we have never tried a more open and sector in the downstream, in the natural gas business industry. So I think that from now on we will see opening in the pre-salt. It's the biggest opportunity that we have in Brazil to attract investments and to get benefits for the country, generate jobs and taxes. But we also see an enormous transformation in the downstream sector and the natural gas industry as well.
Yes, it's definitely a period of transformation. So let us understand a little bit more about the potential of Brazil in comparison with the rest of the region and in a global perspective. And I want to bring Jason into the discussion on that. Jason, where do you think Brazil stands in terms of a regional comparison? And I'm also thinking of Mexico right now, which is a little bit of a darling of the Latin America energy industry at the moment.
I think it's interesting. I think, I would share Decio's view that, of optimism regarding Brazil. I think that the oil sector, writ large, in the international oil companies, the majors, are interested in Brazil. I think geologically there is a lot of potential in Brazil. I mean, everybody is interested in the pre-salt. That being said, when I talk to people in the sector, there is a great deal of concern right now regarding what they view as instability, both within who's running the government and also what the policies are. And so I think that there's a sense of wait and see how everything shakes out, how the new administration puts itself together. There are cautious signs of optimism, the advancing in the legislative branch of a bill that would basically revoke Petrobras's requirement that it operate all new pre-salt projects, that would have a 30% minimum stake in all of those projects. The international majors have been very unhappy about that because it basically removes a lot of their profit potential from getting into those projects. They don't want to be junior partners to a national oil company in that. So I think all of this is seen as good, but there is a wait and see attitude coming from companies. And to kind of take a broader perspective and look at it sort of from the regional perspective. I think, 2007, 2008, several years ago, the industry really saw Brazil and the pre-salt as, the most exciting opportunity in Latin America. Then the Brazilian government put in place these policies that, were aimed at giving Petrobras the primary role, and then that dissuaded a lot of interest from other private companies. You've then had the price plunge, the oil price plunge that happened starting in 2014. So companies are now investing a lot less money and are much more discerning about where they're going to put those funds. And interesting enough, you mentioned Mexico. Mexico, which had been closed off to international oil investment for 75 plus years, just about, had their own energy opening with a legislative reform in 2013, 2014, and companies are extremely interested in what's going on there. And for Brazil, there's now really a new competitor. In December of this year, the Mexican government is going to be auctioning off a bunch of blocks, deep water exploration blocks in the Gulf of Mexico, including some highly interesting blocks that are just over the border, the maritime boundary from U.S. production, from a zone where all sorts of international companies are producing lots of oil in U.S. waters. So I think that is new competition that Brazil didn't have 5 or 6 years ago. And the Mexicans have really gone out of their way in this opening process to provide terms that are interesting, that are attractive to international companies. I think there's a sense now that Brazil is sort of behind that. Not that they can't catch up, but I think Mexico is sort of the new darling for the industry, at least in the region right now.
I think he looks at me and he kind of has this apology in his eyes when he says these things about Brazil, but I understand it's okay. You can be honest. Juliano,
one second.
Go ahead.
It may be behind, but it's catching up.
Catching up. See, the optimism is still here. Juliano, still in the spirit of framing this discussion, when we talk about Brazil nowadays, we can't just forget that we are in the middle of still a very serious crisis in the economy and the political scenario. And a lot of when we talk about the crisis in Brazil, there's a lot of talk about the impact that the crisis in the oil industry has brought into the general economy and what could be, how much of an impact it could provide to the economy if we are successful in revamping the industry. So can you give us a little bit of a sense of the importance of the oil and gas sector and the energy sector in general for the larger economy in Brazil and what's the impact that it's had in this crisis?
Well, I think that the sector has a huge importance in Brazil, but if I may add a different perspective here,
Please.
I think that we must say something about the car wash operation that is very big and started in this sector, and started particularly in Petrobras. It was an investigation involving former directors of Petrobras, and I think that everybody in Brazil is seeing what is happening in this investigation, and also for the people that are going to do investments in the country, it became very important. When you ask me how can we picture the importance of Petrobras, I may say to you that I used to cover judicial issues in my country. I used to cover the Brazilian Supreme Court for 18 years. And that's why my newspaper asked me to cover the car wash operation. And I was trying to get my scoops as a journalist. And I remember that one big scoop that I discovered was when I reached a person that she was a manager of Petrobras, and she was denouncing many corruption practice inside the company, and Petrobras managed to send this woman overseas. She was sent to Singapore because she was denouncing, and I remember that I found her, and just after that, my newspaper, it was like a big story, because she has some emails that she sent to the former president of Petrobras, Graça Foster, and at that time, Graça Foster used to say that she didn't know anything about corruption in the company, but these emails just proved that she knew many things that was passing inside the company. And just after that, my newspaper asked me, and this is very usual in terms of journalism, when you publish a good story, everybody used to think that your bosses are going to came to you and give their congratulations, but no, they came to me and they asked me, we have a new edition for the next day, and what do you have for us? And at that time, I had a document that I get with some people that used to work inside Petrobras, and these people were very angry about the corruption situation over there. And it was a very simple document, about 2 or 3 pages, and it describes what I was just beginning to understand, that there was a cartel over there. So I want to talk
Juliano,
just...
you're in the center of all of this.
Maybe, no. I think that the cartel really is on the center of this whole discussion, because I had it was just a simple document, and I talked to my bosses. I really wanted to publish this document, but they asked me, we are going to run a story saying that all companies that are doing contracts with Petrobras, they are inside this big corruption scandal. So you must get us more documents. We cannot publish that with only one document. So I started to chase for another proofs, and by that time, as Andrea knows very well, if you don't get your scoop published, you get scooped. And I was scooped by the authorities, because CADE, which is the antitrust authority in Brazil, 1 month after that, CADE launched a big report saying that all the companies that were doing contracts with Petrobras, or the big ones, most of these companies were involved in this scandal. And to get into the point, it was just like that. The cartel began with a group that they used to call the 9 club. It's a club of 9 companies. Then they get to the 16 club, and then they get to the 24 companies club. So
what I'm hearing you saying is that basically it was the largest companies, the largest construction companies in Brazil involved, and that was what had such a trickle-down effect into the economy.
And they are all involved, and that is the point that I really want to make here, is that all these companies, most of them are denying all the accusations, but some of them, they already signed some agreements, some leniency agreements, and they are paying the Brazilian treasures, and they are confessing everything that they did. So I think that we have to wait a little bit. I know that we really want to get investments, and I know how this is important for the Brazilian economy. But I think that by now we have really to watch the daily newspapers to see what is going on, and also to see which company is going to be able to do contracts with Petrobras, because some of them they could be forbade by the government to negotiate with Petrobras. And so I think we are in the middle of this big operation that we can compare with the clean hands in Italy. Is kind of difficult to say that we are in the middle, because car wash operation is now in the phase number 32. And 2.5 years of this federal police operation, and also involving many politicians. But I think that we have to see what is going to happen day by day to have the whole picture of what is going to happen with oil and gas sector in Brazil as well.
So
May I
that's your own
put a point on what he said? I touched it very briefly in the papers, is the situation of the service industry. A few years ago, if you were an oil company and you're going to be in Brazil, you probably want to partner with Petrobras. And if you were a service company, not a big one, and you wanted to be in Brazil, you like to partner with somebody else. And the obvious suspects were those big, large construction companies, which were diversifying their activities. So some of those companies, they open up oil and gas branches, and they start to offer offshore services and this type of service to the oil industry. Now these guys are in trouble as well. So they are selling assets, they are divesting, they have problems related to compliance. So looking the glass half full, and when you look at this and then you see an opportunity for service companies that are coming to Brazil to develop a new and renewed service sector there to service not only Petrobras, but also these new companies that will come, I'm sure, with the change in the pre-salt regulations. And then when we see the way that the industry was operating in Brazil, it's quite unique. When you go and see the way the industry operates in the Gulf or in North Sea, you don't see the way that we see in Campos and Santos Basin in Brazil, in which Petrobras operates everything. They have the whole logistics structure. They do everything for themselves. And when you see the way that the IOCs operate, they operate in a completely different way, hiring integrated services for support. So I see for smaller companies, the service companies, opening up of a new horizon of opportunities in Brazil as well as a result of this situation.
So let me follow up on that. I have a couple more questions about Petrobras, because it's such an important player in Brazil and will continue to be a major player. First of all, We mentioned a little bit this law that's probably going to be approved in early August that ends the mandatory participation of Petrobras and the mandatory operatorship that Petrobras has in the pre-salt fields. Why do you think that's such a game changer, coming up from what you're saying about the opening up of opportunities?
Well, the pre-salt is an enormous geological player. 40, 50, maybe more billion barrels of potential reserves. Geological risk it's very low because most of the wells drilled in the region show that they are productive. When the pre-salt was discovered in the end of the last decade, Optimism was around in Brazil, and I remember talking to representatives of international oil companies. We have some here, and they were extremely excited by the pre-salt. Oil prices were
very high.
Very high, so everybody was very keen to participate, and there was a bid round scheduled for I guess 2008, and excitement was high, and then the government canceled the bid round, started discussing the new regulation, and bid rounds were stopped by around 5 years. And eventually, we had a new model of contract for the pre-salt area, in which Petrobras was the sole operator with minimum of 30% in all contracts, in a new type of contract, production share instead of concession. So that movement kind of slowed down the investments in the pre-salt, and Petrobras alone was not able to keep up the development in the way the development was possible. So opportunities were lost. Now with this change in the regulation, if we open the pre-salt for other operators, we'll see investment inflow, technology, people, knowledge, everybody working in the same region, so the learning curve will be faster, and production gains will be easier to obtain. It's much more productive when you have different players competing and doing things simultaneously, and they learn from each other's mistakes, and you have a much more aggressive approach to exploration and production. So if the pre-salt is open for foreign companies and private companies, Brazilian private companies as well, we can anticipate that the investments will flow much faster to Brazil.
Jason, on that note, to us Brazilians, it's like we're going back to 2006 to that level of excitement that we had with the pre-salt, that we're now seeing that finally maybe that potential will be realized. But do you think that the international community, the companies are seeing this potential change in the legislation with the same optimism? Are they as ready as us in Brazil to invest as soon as this is approved?
I think to invest as soon as it's approved is probably not going to happen. I mean, in the first place, the ANP, the National Licensing Agency in oil, they'll have to do a bid round, and they'll have to set that up. There's talk that they would do the next pre-salt bid round at some point next year, so that would take several months. So it wouldn't be, from one day to the next change. But as I'd mentioned before, I think that there is not a reluctance, but I think that there's sort of a wait-and-see attitude. Companies are a little gun-shy about what they've seen in Brazil with the changes where you went from, as Decio pointed out, the concession model, a relatively open, very attractive playing field for foreign investment in the oil sector. Then the PT government under Lula and Dilma shut that down. And so now there's talk about, okay, it's changing, and I think in principle companies are very interested in that. They expect the law to change, all that's to the good, but I think that there's still a sense that companies want to just see how things go out, how things shape up, and with Dilma expected to be officially formally removed from office via impeachment sometime in August, I think that would give companies at least a sense of further confidence that this new government at least has some legs, has some staying power. One thing, though, that I think we should mention is we're talking all about the pre-salt, which is very, which is obvious because the pre-salt is really the biggest bounty of oil and gas resources that Brazil has discovered. But the country has something like, I don't remember the exact number, but something like 24 hydrocarbons basins. Many of them are onshore. Not all pre-salt. There are a lot of other oil and gas opportunities in Brazil, and under the PT governments, since the discovery of the pre-salt, those areas have really been, I would say, neglected or even ignored. There are smaller companies in Brazil that are producing in some of those basins. I've talked to companies as far back as 2008, 2009, when sort of the bid rounds, as Decio mentioned, were sort of put on hold as the government figured out, its pre-salt policy. Companies have been saying, we want them to do a bid round in, the north and, mature fields or something where we can get in there. All of the companies, everybody's focus in Brazil has been on the pre-salt, which was completely dominated by Petrobras. So then all of the service companies, ignored everybody else, and they just looked at Petrobras because that was where the big opportunities were for contracts. I mean, leaving aside the issues of, corruption and what other incentives that they might have had. But even just, looking at Petrobras and the pre-salt up here, with so much, wealth and so much opportunity, and everything else got short shrift. I think that's something that the government could, turn to. There was an attempt at the end of last year to do a bid round in mature fields, which didn't really go anywhere. Only, something like 10%. I think it was 266 blocks were on offer. Something like 30-something were actually taken up, and then there was an issue with some of the awards and that were revoked. But I think that that's something that could bear fruit more quickly, and certainly that would also give, kind of help the industry become more resilient. Because even for those service companies that weren't involved in the corruption scandal, because everybody was so dependent on Petrobras, Petrobras got hit, Petrobras started cutting back, reevaluating its business model, all these other service companies then had nobody else to work for. So I think if the attention of the new government shifts away a bit from the pre-salt, opens up other opportunities, that could help Brazil develop a sort of a more balanced, healthier oil sector.
Mm-hmm. That's very important. And there were plans many years ago, decades ago, for Petrobras to divest in those mature fields in the northeast, but it never happened. And now they have few mature fields and onshore fields that are for sale. And I listened last week from the new Secretary for Petroleum and Gas in the Energy Ministry that the government is preparing a bid round this year to auction areas in the neighborhood of these old mature fields that Petrobras has put for sale in order to develop a cluster that may interest this type of mid-sized company. So that will be very important to activate and to give a boon to this type of industry in Brazil.
Juliano, well, I'll let Jason finish, and then I'll pass to Juliano for a question.
Very briefly, to go to your point earlier about Mexico, I think that's something that Mexico has done that Brazil could learn from, that in the upstream opening in Mexico, they set out a goal of creating new, small, Mexican-based oil and gas startups to do their own exploration. So it wouldn't just be Pemex and international companies. And I think that that's something that Brazil could emulate as well.
Thank you. So Juliano, still on that point before we move on to other sources of energy as well and other opportunities, as Petrobras divests and opens up new opportunities for other players to come into the game, not only domestic but also international, of course. One thing, and that I want to finish with this point on this topic, one thing that people still are concerned about is the level of corruption and the business risk that is to invest in Brazil, domestically and internationally. Do you think that 2 years after Lava Jato and with all the scandals that we had, how do you think that the environment for investment in Brazil is with regards to the corruption risk?
Well, we used to run the bad news, but I think that I can add a positive note here because Lava Jato is being really revolutionary in the country, and we have now many executives that were denying accusations, and they are signing for plea bargains. We have more than 50 plea bargains in Brazil in 2 years, and we have, during the car wash operation, we have 5 leniency agreements. So I think that for the future we have a very good perspective. And also, let me add something also about this new law that is being under discussion in our congressman. I think it's a very good opportunity, not only for foreign companies, but also for Brazil and also for Petrobras. I remember that when I was covering the scandal during the beginning of car wash operation in 2014, I remember that I talked to some people inside the company, and I realized that Petrobras could be broke. And that was a shock for me. I was stunned by this possibility, because once being a Brazilian, you grow up having this big, strong, solid company that we are very proud of. Like Petrobras was something untouchable in Brazil, something very large and very big. But seeing the numbers and the numbers of the corruption, it was like for a refinery in the state of Pernambuco, refinery Abreu e Lima, they were going to pay something like 2.5 billions of reais, and after all the negotiations, the bad negotiations, they pay like 20 billion. So, and there are many refineries like that, and many bad projects of this size. So they are losing a lot of money, and also Petrobras has to invest in pre-salt. And at that time, at the end of 2014, and also during last year, it was impossible to think how Petrobras was going to invest in pre-salt, because oil prices were down, and the company was facing all these accusations, and also because of the government, Dilma Rousseff government, that used to have this idea that foreign companies was going to take the natural resources of Brazil, which is so old and, allow me to say, so stupid, because they are not going to take our lands or our ocean. They are going to help Petrobras to take the oil, and they are going to pay for that, and they are going to bring also technology to the country. So I think that now we are going over from all this
older
arguments.
notions.
Yeah, yeah. And now I see much better perspective for Brazil and for the company also.
So Décio, on that note of maybe the change in the pre-salt is just a first step or a first sign that Brazil is changing how it considers its own natural resources and how we can open up the sector for other companies. What other steps are you recommending on your paper that you think are feasible in the near term to change the upstream sector in Brazil? What else should the government be doing, and what do you think can be done?
Well, Petrobras can do everything. I think that's one of the lessons that we learned during this past few years. And by trying to do everything, they end up doing very little. I worked for Petrobras for many, many years. I'm very proud of my career there. And it's a fantastic company. It's not a corrupt company, as they say. Some of Petrobras employees, they betrayed the confidence and the trust of the company and their colleagues, and they did what they did in association with, well, we see in the papers. But the company, it's a very professional company which was able to develop the technology they developed and to do what they did and achieve what they achieved. And if Petrobras is professionally managed, they can do a lot of good things, but as I said, but they can't do everything. you mentioned that Brazil has several other alternatives in geological province for exploration, and that's correct. And since Petrobras had the monopoly in Brazil since since the 50s, 53, only Petrobras was able to drill in Brazil for oil and natural gas. We had one opening up in 74 during the military government under Geisel, that we had risk contracts with very limited impact. We just Merluza field in the Santos Basin was discovered by Shell, I guess. But nothing else happened. And then we had the opening up of the Petrobras monopoly in 97, and then we saw a boom in exploration and production. More than 100 companies drilling in Brazil. And after this period, we slowed down again. So it's time now to bring companies to, not only for the pre-salt, we have other deep offshore post-salt perspectives. We have mature and undiscovered shallow water place. We have the whole conjunction of sedimentary bases and onshore in Brazil from Amazonas down to the south, which were very little explored during this last 60 years. And we have the unconventional. Mm-hmm. Unconventional in Brazil is untouched because of there's no regulation for that. The ANP tried to do something a few years ago in, I guess, 2012. And then some discussions on the environmental side of that is stopped the initiative. So we have never tried anything related to unconventional. And I would like to guess that if Petrobras hadn't found the pre-salt in 2007, probably we had focused in the unconventional by that time. But they didn't, and nobody did as well. So we have opportunities across the board in the exploration side in Brazil.
Speaking of those opportunities, one follow-up question. Your report also mentions a lot about the natural gas opportunities in Brazil, much of which, of course, would come from the pre-salt as well, but it's something that when you talk about the energy sector in Brazil, you usually don't focus on. What do you think are the potential for gas exploration?
Well, the natural gas industry in Brazil is in its childhood. First big movement in the natural gas sector in Brazil was in the 90s when Petrobras decided to build the Bolivia-Brazil pipeline. Petrobras has always focused on oil production, mm-hmm. as most of our companies until now. And natural gas was kind of, there, but not a priority. When you said about the candles and things like that, and the blackouts, then natural gas became an alternative to supply energy in moments in which the hydropower plants in Brazil were not able to keep up the demand. But that was a kind of stop and go. And since Petrobras controls the whole industry, transportation, production, they buy other producers' production in Brazil, imports, LNG. So there is a monopoly in the natural gas industry in Brazil that's about to break. I think the natural gas has the most interesting opportunity in Brazil because that industry is going to change. Petrobras is selling the pipelines. They are selling the 2 natural gas import terminals. They are selling some power plants. And they are saying they are not the big player in natural gas anymore from now on. So they will open up a space for private companies to get in and to share this opportunity with Petrobras. When we see the power generation sector, for the first time in history, Brazil is depending much more on thermal generation than hydropower generation. And if we talk about thermal power generation, naturally we think about natural gas. And if you have more natural gas power generation, so you have more natural gas consumption, we probably start with more imported LNG, but you will have an option for future offshore gas. I didn't explore very much in my paper, but if you go drilling in the onshore basins and exploring the unconventional, then you have an opportunity to develop gas production in inland. So you can develop consumption in regions in Brazil that they're not quite developed. And then you need pipelines. So there is enormous space for investments in the natural gas industry to be short.
So I know that a lot of people in the audience also have their questions, and I'm going to get to it in a second. I just have a couple more to ask from our panelists, so prepare your questions if you have them. Jason, on this topic of natural gas, we recently had another report on Argentina, and that was basically the focus of the report. Do you think that the international industry sees Brazil as a potential source of natural gas as well? I remember once the economist said that big oil is becoming big gas because they're changing because of oil prices and a lot of other environmental concerns. There's a lot of investment in gas going forward. Is Brazil on their horizon?
Less so. I think Décio made the comment that Brazil's gas sector industry is in its infancy or something to that effect. I think most of the gas production in Brazil, the attention on gas has been gas that's associated gas coming out of the oil fields in the pre-salt. So there is definitely a sense, I think geologically a sense that Brazil could produce a lot of gas. To date, the gas has really gone for the domestic market, whereas in Argentina, in the past, Argentina, well, it needs its gas now for the domestic market. In the past, though, Argentina was much more geared towards exporting gas. So I think in Brazil, the focus is really on the domestic market. And, the focus there really needs to be on putting together the infrastructure to be able to supply that gas. As I understand it, in Brazil, the pipeline construction is not something that you can just do, in a straightforward fashion. You need concessions, and the government needs to, authorize pipelines to be built. One little fact or fun fact that still sort of makes my head spin when I think about it is that Brazil doesn't have gas storage, capability. So if you produce gas and you can't hold on to it. And I think that's also, part of the reason that during periods of drought, Brazil has to import large amounts of LNG. They can't take their own production and kind of store it, for need if you need it later. So I think a lot of those issues regarding infrastructure really need to be sorted out first before, Brazil becomes a big gas player. But certainly there is room to increase production substantially, particularly as, hopefully the country attracts more investment into its upstream plays.
Mm-hmm. Brazil gas consumption is smaller than Argentina. There's enormous space for gas to penetrate the energy matrix.
So I want to ask one other question to Juliano regarding other sources of energy. Everybody knows that Brazil relies a lot in hydropower for this energy generation. And that's actually also controversial in Brazil, not only for the environmental impact, but some construction of dams have recently been tainted by corruption scandals as well. But the Dilma government and apparently the interim government, if it's confirmed, the new government, is also very focused on infrastructure and in diversifying the matrix. Juliano, how do you see going forward, provided that this current government is confirmed, their investment in infrastructure being also opening up potential avenues for diversifying the energy sector in Brazil?
Well, first of all, we have to remember that Dilma Rousseff was very worried about this subject because we lived a major energy crisis in 2001 in Brazil during the administration, the end of the second term of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and that was deeply and badly remarkable for the country. It affects the economy and also politics. And one of the things that Dilma used to say during these years was that she was the Ministry of Energy in Brazil, and she did whatever she could to avoid another major energy crisis. And now I said Dilma was because I think that Dilma is not going back to the government. We have one vote to be done, maybe in late August or maybe at the beginning of the September. It will be just after the Olympic Games, and the Senate is going to vote the impeachment, and all the perspectives that we have is that Michel Temer is going to remain president. And by that time, I think that many things are going to become pretty clear in Brazil in terms of what kind of politics we are going to have to boost the economy. And we can say that in terms of energy, and also we can say in terms of infrastructure also, because Brazil is an emerging market, and all the emerging markets are trying to have more capital inflows. And for that, infrastructure is very important, but you have to, you must have a plan to sell overseas, to have this inflows of capitals. And Dilma's plan was proved that was not so good. It didn't reach good results in the country. So now we have many ideas. The information that we have is that this government has many ideas of what to do, and we have to wait a little bit to see what they are going to do to improve energy as well.
I want to turn to the audience now for questions. If you have a question, just please raise your hand. And we have microphones that are going to run to the audience, and please just identify yourself. And let's start with the gentleman in the center here.
Greg Harrington from law firm Arbor & Porter. There's a number of lawsuits in New York against Petrobras, including a very large class action. And the settlement amounts that are being discussed, as I understand, are significant. Do you see what part, I think part of the market sees as a bit of an overhang over Petrobras and some of the other players, this lawsuit, and also some of the other investigations that are going on. Do you see, many of these sorts of lawsuits are settled ultimately between the parties. Do you see the government having the will and Petrobras perhaps having the resources to be able to settle this lawsuit and sort of eliminate that overhang from the market?
Well,
Juliano,
yes, I think that we are going to have a summary judgment in August. The trial in New York, it's going to begin in September and it's going to end in December. And we have this major question that we are also doing like every day as a journalist. I'm trying to get this information, if Petrobras is going to make a settlement or not. By this time, we know that Petrobras just changed its president. Now it's Pedro Parente. It's a much more, how can I say, pro-market president. But in terms of this big suit, the administration of Parente is not changing what the last administration of Petrobras was saying about all the accusations. They are denying the accusations. So I think that they are denying the accusations because they are going to negotiate a settlement. I think it would be very stupid to not negotiate this, to go to trial with, I heard that they have more than 1 million pages in this lawsuit against Petrobras. And I covered the scandal, and I know that many people there, we must say it's a huge company, and there are a lot of good workers over there. We are talking about a company with 70,000 workers.
It used to be 80, but they laid some people off.
80, yeah, something like that. So there are a lot of good workers and some workers that also help us as a journalist to cover the scandal. But at the same time, many people did a lot of bad things, and corruption was I think the company was rotting, to be simple, you know, to be clear. It was a tragedy what they did in the company. So I think that by now they are going to do a settlement, or they are going to face the risk of paying an amount of money that we are also trying to discover how much it's going to be. Some people say that to be like $5 billion, some people 15. I heard also 20, 30. So it's like if we are in crisis, who is going to give more? It's 50 billion or whatever. But it will also be very delicate in terms of the relations between the governments, between the Brazilian government and the American government is. So imagine what will happen if the President of the United States must call Michel Temer and say, oh, we are putting a big fine on you. That's in the DOJ investigation also, because we have the lawsuit in New York, and we also have this DOJ investigation. So I think that they are going to do a settlement, but by now we have no public indication on that.
Yes, there's a lot of concern about a potential FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, fine against Petrobras. Previous decisions by DOJ on FCPA against companies have imposed record fines to companies, and they would only really damage Petrobras' situation at this point. And speaking of low-hanging fruits, I want to ask Jason, because Petrobras has about $130 billion in debt right now, and I think about 30 billion of that is to mature next year. How do you think that's affecting their ability to move forward at this point?
I mean, I think the debt load is a complicating factor. I don't know that it's a determining factor. I don't think that it's causing them undue problems. I mean, they're not teetering on the edge of this is not a PDVSA situation. They're not at the risk of default. I mean, they're definitely trying to divest assets. To raise cash and not just to pay down debt, but also to just kind of facilitate operations. I don't really know that strategy is going to go as well as they've planned. I mean, they're talking about $15 billion over, I guess, last year and this year, and at that point they've divested a very small fraction of that. And I think this is not the greatest market to be trying to sell oil assets in. Other companies are not exactly flush with cash either. But I think that they're under, not just Parenti, but under the previous administration. Petrobras has worked to sort of strengthen its finances, and that's, definitely, they're in a better situation now. I think for Petrobras, a big question is, what happens with their credit rating. They've been downgraded numerous times. Just this past quarter, they lost a fair chunk of money again. Oil prices are now improving a bit. The government seems to now be giving Petrobras greater flexibility to set its own prices so they can actually cover their costs. In the past, Petrobras had, the government leaned on Petrobras to keep its fuel prices low, to keep people happy. So, I think that they still have a way to climb, a hole to climb out of, but I don't think the debt is something that's, of imminent danger to the company.
That's good news. If you have a question, raise your hand. I think I'm going to go to Jason Marzak, my colleague here first, just because he's my favorite and my boss. But there will be more time for it.
And also, thank you, Andre. And also, Desio, I had obviously the privilege of having a sneak peek of your publication. So I'm going to ask specifically about one of the recommendations that you had in there, which is to improve the efficiency of the offshore support industry and infrastructure as well. My question is, how do you do this in the current context? What's possible? Because this, from my perspective, this is so critical, is improving this offshore support industry. Julian, you started to talk about this, I think, a little bit in your remarks, saying that you need to have a plan. The government has many ideas, but I'd like to drill down on what could be feasible in the short to medium term to really improve that offshore industry and infrastructure.
Well, the offshore service industry was developed to attend Petrobras requirements. And Petrobras controls its own logistics system. which is not the most optimized one. So we will see Petrobras needing to cut costs as the other IOCs are doing as well. And we see in the future Petrobras looking for more cost-effective solutions in the offshore service industry. So there is a room for new formats of services to be offered in the Campos and Santos basins and for the pre-salt operations. I mean, much more integrated service because Petrobras integrates the service for themselves, and the IOCs, they don't do that. They just hire the services. Petrobras hires the boats, the cranes, the trucks, the warehouses. They buy everything. They don't integrate their services. And what you see now in Brazil is a rush for integrating services and providing most cost-effective services in the industries. That's something that we normally don't see because it's so behind the scenes that people don't pay attention to that. But I mean that because it may bring opportunity for international service companies that want to join the Brazil operations.
I want to go to the left side of the audience now. Someone had a question that I skipped. Well, then I'm going to go back to the right side. The gentleman here in the third row.
Good morning. Mark Langevin, Director of the Brazil Initiative at George Washington. I wanted to ask a question. You know, after the announcement of the pre-salt, we had some excitement about some of the Brazilian private sector companies. Most of that excitement was around OGX, but apparently, you know, they've flamed out since then. But there are a number of private Brazilian E&P companies. Some have been implicated in the Lava Jato, Queiroz Galvão being one of them, the Odebrecht subsidiary and so forth. But there are others, very small, that are doing the onshore drilling, some offshore. When we look at the potential for new regulation, and it's good that Jason mentioned that much of the problem with Petrobras weren't just the kickbacks. The administered prices are really the source of the debt that now Petrobras has to work out with low prices, right? But how can we take a look at potential new regulation that allows Petrobras to work it out, at the same time allows Brazilian private sector E&P companies to get more involved, maybe have some more of that horizontal technology transfer? Obviously, Petrobras has the best deep water technology in the ballpark right now. How can we look at regulation that's going to strengthen Brazilian headquartered firms?
Well, some of the Brazilian E&P companies, they have stakes in the pre-salt, but they are not operators. Petrobras is there. But I see this movement of Petrobras divesting the onshore fields, the mature fields, the shallow water fields, as the opportunity for these companies to step in and grow, and even for newcomers to be developed. And if the government does what they say they are doing, that they open up areas for new bid rounds around those areas in which Petrobras is selling, then we see the right movement for attracting and helping these companies to develop. I think going from the onshore to shallow waters, so they need less investments, they easier for the smaller companies, not the big shot like the pre-salt, and that will develop the mid-size E&P business in Brazil.
So I have a follow-up question on that to Juliano. Do you think that in the current economic environment in Brazil, that the private companies, especially the middle-sized ones, are ready to fill up that vacuum and make those investments again?
Well, I think that by now we really need some foreign investment, and I think that we have a government that it's gaming, the Michel Temer government. It's more open to foreign investment in the country. I particularly don't like monopolies, and we have many in Brazil. We have Petrobras, we have postal service in Brazil, but all those monopolies, they were involved in corruption scandals. 10 years ago, if you ask any Brazilian which institutions they believe, they should answer that it was the post office that was really doing well. But now, post office was linked to for recent years ago, post office was linked to Mensalão and to many bad politicians, and the same happened to Petrobras. So we are learning a very difficult lesson, and I think that because of this bad news, we are going to have some good news in the recent future, which is to open the markets to a real competitive environment, not that environment of cartel that we used to have and that I described here, that there was 9 club, 16 companies club, and that was for a reason. They organized these clubs because if you were a construction company in Brazil and you used to have profits of 20, 30, or 15 million reais, and you want to go further, you must have contracts with Petrobras, with the monopoly. So that was a real bad environment for business. And now I think that we are learning this lesson in a very hard way. Many people are going to jail learning this lesson. And because of that, I think in the near future, we are going to have a much more better and competitive environment for business.
One note on that. There is opportunity as well for foreign capital, private equity funds, and other type of investors to join and help these mid-sized and small-sized Brazilian E&P companies to do more in this new environment.
So I want to go back to the audience, the lady here in the second row.
Hello, I'm Alex Valderrama with Chevron. Thank you very much for all your comments. I have one comment and one question. Actually, one comment, 2 questions. First one is, on the current political situation, we know that the interim president is doing a good job. We're seeing positive changes. Pedro Parente, number 1, being a very positive change. His statement saying, his conditions about no political appointees while I'm here, and just let me do my job, and I'll make sure that Operación Yato keeps going. So those are good signs, and we see changes. But remember that the oil and gas industries are very long-term investments, right? Long-term commitments. What is the likelihood that once these 2 years are up, that we'll see any drastic changes? That's my first question. And the second one is, does your paper include any recommendations around the changes around bid calendars, calendarization, and local content, those kind of issues? Thank you.
So that's you. Let's start with the sort of the easier one, which is, I know the answer to that, but what do you say about auction bids and calendars in your paper?
We should have a permanent calendar for bid rounds, covering all geological province. We should have a more competitive local content policy. It will benefit not only the industry, Brazil as well. And now the difficult one, yeah?
The difficult one. So do you think, this is for all of us here, in 2018, say, regardless of how the impeachment process turns out, do you think that Brazil is at a risk of overturning some of the good decisions that are being made now?
I'm optimistic. If you read my paper, you realize that. But I would like to say that I think that we had learned the hard lesson, and country has been learning from bad experience during the past decades. And I think after all this experiment that we have passed this past few years, I hope that we have learned that we need to have an open economy, attract investments, and allow players to run the business while the government regulates and take care of social issues.
Juliano, we were just discussing the same topic in our breakfast before we came here today. Do you think that Brazil has put to the past really these experiments of the past decades?
Well, I think that we are going to see a lot of water under the bridge, and we have this operation that I mentioned that is in phase number 32, and it's just an ongoing operation. And as I mentioned, we had already more than 50 plea bargains, and once somebody signed for a plea bargains, this person started to tell another stories, and these stories are going to be used for the federal police to do another phase of the car wash operation. And that's why we are having, like last week it was 2 phases and 4 or 5 different operations. And so I think that we really don't know what are we going to have in 2018, but I must say that we are really learning many lessons, many hard lessons, and I think that we can predict that the environment for business, it's going to be better.
Jason, we also discussed this topic of political stability in Brazil and how important that is as a signal to foreign investments. We were just talking about this yesterday. So tell the rest of the audience what you told me.
I think that, well, to just sort of riff off what Desi and Giuliano just said, I think, in terms of overturning these policies that are being changed, I mean, really, at this stage, I think the only large party that's sort of wedded to that kind of state-led model is the PT. So it becomes a question of, do you think the PT...
May I make one question, one comment only? This regulation of pre-salt, the change in the regulation, it started during Dilma government a few months ago. I mean, even the PTs was trying to change something.
Right, no, but Dilma and her sort of band and some of the smaller left-wing parties too have been very critical of that. But do you think that they're going to take over, in the next presidential election? And I think that would probably be, I mean, never say never. We have Trump, but I think at the moment it doesn't look great for them to do that. So I think that probably gives some, maybe some indication that this will all not just disappear quickly. And in terms of what we had said yesterday, do you mean?
It was about the political stability, and I'm going to have to quote you here. It said,
Okay.
well, we are used to some other countries that will remain unnamed, changing completely their policies every 10 years, right? You go one way, you go the other. You go in one way, you go the other. And Brazil is not exactly. It's not super easy to predict what's going to happen in Brazil, but it's not that much of unstable place either.
Right. The country that shall remain unnamed was Argentina. Where oil companies, that are people that I've talked to have said, things look good now with the new government. Cristina's out, and there's more, there's a more investor-friendly attitude. But the expectation is that Argentina goes through cycles every decade, where in comes a populist, and then you have a lot of fun. I don't think Brazil is in that category. I think the sense from the oil companies that I speak to is that, and as Desi and Giuliano have said, that there are lessons learned here. And I think it's important in the oil sector to remember that, Petrobras, I think Jason or somebody, or I think you had mentioned before that, Petrobras has a lot of, very, well-respected people, a lot of, they have great expertise in drilling in deep water, that there is a very strong base there of people who know what they're doing, and in the government now, as the experience of the past, the PT rule and Dilma's presidency has shown, that sort of those policies led down a cul-de-sac. You got the Lava Jato scandal. You have a very Petrobras used to be, a very strong, very well-regarded national oil company. Now it has a lot of problems. I mean, it's not completely devastated. Again, it's not PDVSA. But, I think that there does seem to me to be a sense that the change that we're seeing now, will be long-lasting.
One other comment, please. Regarding the stability of the rules. the way the Brazil dealt with the pre-salt discovery, contracts were not broken, regulation changed onwards. I mean, everything that was in place was respected. What they did, they stopped for 5 years the auction system, but they didn't change any contract, they didn't break any contract, and they did the new regulation for the future, and the old contracts were respected, and that's very good.
No, I think that's absolutely true.
And I'll add my own grain of salt here. I think, as we mentioned before, it is true that the past couple governments have kind of made a mess out of the oil and gas sector and lost a lot of opportunities, but even they had realized that regardless of the rhetoric, out of necessity, things had to change in Brazil. And I think it's possible, PT being in the opposition for the next couple of years, that the rhetoric will come back as with their own nationalist flair. But I don't think even in the unlikely scenario that they got back into power, that they would go back to those failed policies of the past. They also realize that it's impossible to continue as we were, and they want to take advantages of the opportunities as well.
We'll have the press to show them.
Yeah.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Please, the gentleman here in the second row.
I'm Hai Gugaras with Argus Media. How strong is the opposition from Oil Workers Federation to the change from abolishing Petrobras' subsold 30% margin?
Well, I will try to make a guess here, but the unions, they were very well connected with the PT government, so they were kind of supporting the government during all this periods. Of course, they kept their nationalist ideas, but I think that their power is diminished now with all this situation that we live in the country, and opposition from the unions won't be as strong as they would have been if that happened in the past.
Juliano, I'll have a follow-up on that for you. We know that changes in the pre-salt used to be very controversial in Brazil, but the situation might have made this type of bill a little more palatable to the Brazilian public. Do you think that the political will in government and from the electorate as well has changed, and they're more accepting of this kind of change now?
Oh, I think that there is a time that reality just came and show up all the problems that we have. It's impossible for Petrobras to take the oil from Pre-salt alone. It's just impossible. It's not going to happen. So yes, we are having some opposition of the unions, of the petroleros, as we used to call them. They are very linked to PT, and PT is very well organized. Even in the middle of this crisis, they are very organized. You can see that Dilma Rousseff, she is receiving some money. She organizes a website in the internet, and she is being paid by the supporters, by the people that support PT, to travel all over the country to denounce the impeachment process. But we have a scenario in the Senate that the impeachment is very likely to be approved. And we have a scenario in terms of Pre-salt that there is no other way. It's reality. To have the oil, Petrobras just cannot go alone. So the company must have partnerships, and these partnerships are going to come with a new legislation. And I must also add that we have strong judicial institutions in Brazil, and they also deal with problems with contracts and with problems of contracts of foreign companies in Brazil. And our judges, they are very independent, as you can see by the car wash investigation. They are putting some very important people in Brazil in jail, some politicians and some owners of big companies. Take Marcelo Odebrecht for an example. He's in jail since June 2015, and he's one of the most important executives in Brazil. So we have a traditional of independency in our judiciary, which is also good for the country and also good for the business as well.
Wonderful. So I'll take one last question, and then I'm going to do something mean to someone in the audience, but I'll wait for the suspense to build before I do that. So let's go to the gentleman here on the third row.
Thank you. Simon Whistler at Control Risks. It's kind of a comment, it might be a question come out of it at the end, I'm not sure. I think one thing that kind of forgetting or hasn't been mentioned so much in the debate is the oil price. And I think the situation in Brazil right now would be so much different if the oil price was still at 100, 110, whatever it is. It's very easy for the new government to be the anti-Dilma, to come in and sort of promote changes to the regulatory system in a low oil price environment. But if you're looking at the long-term perspective, as an oil and gas investor, then 20, 30 years down the line, the oil price is inevitably going to rise and dip. And Brazil is a country which historically, whether you've got kind of a PT government in charge or a PSDB or whatever it is, it's relatively protectionist. It's not kind of an open, there isn't a big strand of sort of open economy. And so I guess the point is kind of, yes, at the moment, I think there's big opportunities down the line with the opening up of the pre-salt for more. But if the oil price rises up, then there's inevitably going to be voices and demands for change, bigger share of Petrobras, bigger share of the government. And so I think I guess that's just the comment. I don't know. There isn't a question in the end, but just the comment in terms of kind of oil price, I think has just got a huge factor to play in remembering sort of Brazil's kind of long-term trajectory, the sort of political environment there. It's not just about open economies. There's actually a big protectionist streak in the country as well.
There is indeed an excellent comment, and I do think it's a question. And I'll start by saying that here at our center, one of the things that we think about Brazil, the way that we think about the country, is that it's a country in transformation. So I would challenge your notion that the country would go back to being a protectionist, closed economy as soon as the opportunities for that were a little bit more palatable. I think that these experiments showed Brazil that it cannot rely on the external factors only and in the external scenario for its growth, and that the country must change its policies if it wants to have sustainable growth in the future. But I will turn to our colleagues here too and see if they agree with me.
Completely. Just one word.
I do as well, but I think at the same time, I mean, that tendency to kind of loosen the strings on the extractive sector when prices are low and then try to tighten them and take more of the wealth when prices are high, that's not exclusive to Brazil, that's not exclusive to Latin America, it's sort of everywhere. And I think, as Decio had pointed out, I mean, even under the PT in Brazil, when they did try to, sink their claws deeper into the oil sector in the pre-salt, they didn't touch contracts that were already existing. There was no forced renegotiation. And, so I think that combined with the lessons that we've talked about, I think that gives some, hope to companies that the Brazilians won't, suddenly bash them, when prices are up again.
Sure. Can we bring a microphone back, Ali?
Yeah, no, I agree very much on that. I mean, it wasn't as if the whole sort of framework changed just because prices went up. I guess the point is kind of just try not to be too much of a downer on this, but to almost not to expect too much the other way as well, that it's suddenly become kind of a super open sort of oil and gas sector, because I think there's still going to be a big sort of demand for Petrobras to play a very big role in the sector. Change from now, obviously, but I think Petrobras is still going to have a huge part to play. Local content policies, they want to promote Brazilian industry, so I think you'll see changes in regulations to promote or to easing on that, but still not to the degree where companies are going to be able to pick and choose what they can and can't do from services. So that's just my sort of thing. I think absolutely it's not a Venezuela type scenario. It never was, never will be, but at the same time don't expect too much the other way as well.
Well, that's a good cautious outlook. And I think it speaks more also to a matter of time frame. We don't expect the changes to be too immediate. This is a gradual package of regulations that we are hoping and we're supporting change on. We're about out of time, so wrapping up comments here.
Just one comment. Even a few steps may have a very big impact.
Yes, I'm just going to say that we learned some lessons in terms of oil prices because during the last elections, Dilma Rousseff managed to keep the oil prices low, the prices in the gas stations low, to get more votes from the general public, and that was a huge damage in Petrobras. And I think that after that, that is just not going to happen anymore in the country because we were, as newspapers, we are putting that.
We rely on you.
Yeah. We're running this news out loud in the country, so that was another lesson that we learned.
So we are out of time, but I want to do a last act of meanness here, and I want to shed share the spotlight even with someone that's here on the front row. We have our colleague João de Castro Neves from Eurasia Group paying attention to this discussion, and I want to ask him a question about what we've been talking about. Ale, can you please bring the microphone over here?
Is that a surprise for you, João?
Did you expect that my mean act was going to be towards you? No, it's actually an act of not meanness, of ultimate respect. I want to see what João's perspective is on these changes that we're seeing in Brazil now.
Well, thank you for the surprise. No, I generally agree with the comments of this excellent panel. I think that I do see. I think if you were to, summarize the three kind of views here, Jason, Décio, and Juliano, basically, what is being said is that on the one hand, you have positive changes that are being implemented now, if not. Well, they began being implemented by the previous government by necessity, and now I think that they're being implemented by conviction. At the same time, if as Juliano highlights, there are risks, there are dark clouds on the horizon, which is the Lava Jato, which is a kind of a deeper structural change. I think that's happening in Brazil with a strong judiciary and how the way to do business in Brazil. And finally, put in the regional perspective, Brazil is a very important stakeholder. But less so than it thought it was 5 years ago, right? And I think that all in all, I do think that I do agree with the view that while some countries in the region, that have been named already, they go from one extreme to the other every 10 years or so. Brazil is kind of a bit in the middle, right? It's a slow mover in the positive or negative direction, and I do think that that's something. But I think my question would be, although we're out of time, is that if you look at, is there room for Petrobras the way it is right now, the size as an integrated company that does everything, almost literally everything in Brazil, from biofuels to power? Will Petrobras change meaningfully in a sense, in terms of size, in terms of, does a more positive, more open energy sector for Brazil, is it possible with Petrobras the way it is? I mean, you're talking about now divesting pipelines, for example, getting out of the gas sector, for example. I mean, that would be, but overall, I do tend to agree with this.
Thank you. I keep pushing this forward and forward, so I'll have Décio answer this last question, and then we're going to wrap up. So Décio, do you think that Petrobras, the outsized Petrobras that we had in the past decade, has a future, or it's going to change forever?
I don't have any insights from my friends, former colleagues from Petrobras, but I rely on what is said publicly, and it's in the press, that they will reshape the company in order to focus in the pre-salt and deep offshore exploration, and their presence in the gas and especially in downstream business will be different, opening up space for other players. So they are saying that.
So in 2 years, we're probably going to have another panel to see if our predictions were correct. I hope to see you all here again. Well, sooner than that, hopefully. Thank you again all for participating, and please let's have a last coffee outside and talk a little bit more if you can.
Thank you very much.